This was documented, it was measured, and then it quietly disappeared. There is a garden in the middle of an ordinary neighborhood that should not be producing what it produces. No irrigation system, no synthetic inputs, no seasonal replanting, just soil and something that most people stopped paying attention to decades ago. The first time I stood in front of it, I checked twice. I was looking for the hoses. I was looking for the bags of fertilizer stacked near the fence. I was looking for the signs of intervention, because a garden this productive, this alive, this continuous, demanded an explanation. There were none. What I found instead was something far more interesting than a gardening trick. It was a pattern. And once you see a pattern, you cannot unsee it. Here is what the record shows. In documented cases across multiple states, gardens operating without conventional inputs have consistently outperformed high-maintenance plots within 3 to 5 seasons. Not immediately, not in the first year, but consistently, measurably, over time. The data exists. It has always existed. So the question is not whether this works. The question is why the information is not in front of you already. That question has an answer. And it begins with understanding what a garden actually is, not in the way gardening influencers describe it, not in the way seed catalogs frame it, but in the way soil scientists and long-term growers have quietly documented it for over 100 years. A garden is not a product. It is a system. And systems that run themselves do not generate recurring revenue. That single observation explains more about modern gardening than any tutorial ever will. When I first encountered it, I dismissed it. I was skeptical. I had spent 2 seasons failing with conventional methods, buying inputs, replanting annuals, fighting pests with products, and I assumed the failure was mine. I assumed I was doing something wrong. I was not doing something wrong. I was doing exactly what I had been taught. And that is the first thing you need to understand before any of the 25 ideas in this video make sense. The way most people garden today was not designed for you. It was designed around you. There is a difference, and that difference changes everything. Let me give you the timeline. Pre-1940, perennial and self-sustaining garden systems are widely documented across the United States, not as experimental, not as an alternative, as standard practice, post-1950. Annual monoculture systems begin dominating mainstream agricultural education. Input dependency increases. The concept of gardening is slowly redefined around purchasing cycles, seeds every spring, fertilizer every season, pest control every outbreak. By 1970, the idea that a garden could largely sustain itself was treated as folklore. By 1990, it was barely mentioned in mainstream publications. By 2010, the gardeners practicing it are considered eccentric. None of this was accidental. Follow the economics. Annual systems require yearly inputs. Every spring, you return to the market. Seeds, soil amendments, pest sprays, watering equipment. The cycle repeats. The purchasing repeats. The dependency deepens. Now consider a different system. One where the plants return on their own, where the soil improves each year without external inputs, where the workload decreases, not increases, over time. That system does not generate the same recurring revenue. I am not speculating. I am describing a business model conflict that has been quietly shaping what gardening information reaches you and what does not. This is where the 25 trending ideas you are about to learn become significant. Because they are not trends. They are recoveries. They are documented principles that were practiced widely, then quietly moved to the margins, and are now returning because enough people started asking why their gardens kept failing, despite doing everything they were told. I found the first pattern in a community garden in the Midwest. I was documenting how long-term plots performed compared to new ones. The results were consistent and uncomfortable. Plots that had been running for 7 years or more, with minimal intervention, were producing more diverse and stable yields than high input plots in their second or third season. The gardeners running those long-term plots were not buying much. They were observing. They were adjusting. They were letting the system do most of the work. And here is the detail that the internet rarely discusses honestly. The less they interfered, the better the results became. That is not a metaphor. That is not a metaphor. That is a measurable, repeatable observation. And it directly contradicts the way most gardening content frames its advice. I spent 2 full seasons doing it the way most people are told to do it. Spring arrives. You buy seeds or seedlings. You prepare the beds. You plant. You water. You fertilize. You treat for pests. You harvest. The season ends. The garden dies. You start over. Every year from zero. Here is what that cycle costs, and I am not talking about money alone. It costs time. It costs energy. It costs the soil itself because annual tilling disrupts the microbial networks that take years to establish. Every time the soil is turned, the system resets. Every time it resets, it needs external inputs to produce at the same level. You are not maintaining a garden under that system. You are repeatedly rebuilding one. I failed twice before I understood this, and the failure did not feel like a gardening problem. It felt personal. It felt like inadequacy, like I lacked the skill or the patience or the instinct that other growers seem to possess naturally. But here is the detail that changed my thinking. I visited a plot that had been running for 11 years. The gardener was not there. No one was maintaining it that week, and it was producing. Tomatoes from self-seeded plants. Herbs were spreading into the pathways. A dense living mulch covering the soil that no one had applied in 3 seasons. The garden was running without the gardener. And that is when the question stopped being personal. That is when I understood that I had not been failing at gardening. I had been succeeding at a version of gardening that was specifically designed to require my continued intervention. The modern gardening system is not broken. It is working exactly as intended. It keeps you coming back. It keeps you purchasing. It keeps you dependent on information, inputs, and products that reset the moment you stop buying them. The 25 ideas you are about to encounter do not work that way. They are built on a different premise entirely. Not control, not optimization, not maximum output. They are built on the premise that a garden, given the right conditions, will do most of the work itself. That premise makes the industry uncomfortable. And that discomfort is your first signal that you are moving in the right direction. I need to be precise here, because this is where most content fails. The moment someone says 25 ideas, the instinct is to list them, numbered, bulleted, explained in isolation, each one presented as a standalone tip you can apply this weekend and see results by Tuesday. That is not how any of this works. These ideas operate as a system. Each one reinforces the others. And the only way to understand them honestly is to encounter them the way I did, through observation, through failure, through the slow accumulation of evidence that forced me to change what I believed. So here is what I observed. The first idea appeared in that 11-year plot. The soil was never bare. Not for a single day across 3 seasons of observation. Something was always covering it: low-growing plants, fallen leaves, decomposing matter. This is not decorative. Covered soil retains moisture. It suppresses unwanted growth without chemicals. It feeds the organisms below without any external input. The gardener had not decided to mulch. The garden had decided for itself. The second idea appeared when I noticed the companion relationships. Tall plants shade lower ones. Deep-rooted plants draw up minerals that shallow plants absorbed through leaf fall. Plants that repelled specific insects were placed adjacent to plants that those insects preferred. None of it was labeled. None of it was intentional in the way modern gardening describes intention. It had simply been allowed to happen. The third idea was vertical space. A fence line covered with climbing plants producing food in a footprint that would have been wasted otherwise. No purchased structures, no elaborate trellis systems. Just wire and observation. I kept documenting. Rainwater collection, not sophisticated, not engineered, just positioned containers, catching what the sky provided and redirecting it without pumps or electricity. I measured the water savings across a dry August. The numbers were significant. Self-seeding crops. Crops that, when allowed to go to seed at the end of their cycle rather than being pulled, returned the following season without any replanting. Cilantro. Dill. Certain lettuces, arugula. The seeds fell, the soil received them, and in spring they came back. The gardener had not planted them. The previous season had native plants functioning as living fences, not decorative, functional, blocking wind, creating microclimates on their leeward side where cold-sensitive plants extended their season by 2 to 3 weeks. Polyculture beds, multiple species in a single space, produce more stable yields than single crop beds of the same size. The diversity created its own resilience. When one species struggled, another compensated. Composting is not a chore but a loop. Kitchen scraps to compost, compost to soil. Soil to plant, plant to kitchen. The loop closed itself, and external fertilizers became unnecessary within 18 months. No dig growing. I resisted this one the longest because it contradicted everything I had been taught, but the evidence was consistent. Beds that were never tilled maintained better structure, better moisture, and better microbial activity than tilled beds in the same conditions. The act of tilling, repeated annually, was destroying the very infrastructure it was supposed to improve: seed saving. When you purchase seeds every season, you are purchasing genetics that someone else selected. When you save seeds from your strongest plants, you are selecting genetics adapted to your specific soil, your specific climate, and your specific conditions. After 3 seasons of saving, the difference in vigor is measurable. Shade layering. Tall crops provide a canopy. Medium crops receiving filtered light below. Ground-level crops use the remaining moisture and light beneath them. 3 layers of production in the footprint of 1. Time-layered planting. Crops are sequenced so that as one ends, the next begins, without a gap in production and without a gap in soil coverage. The bed never rests empty. Empty beds lose moisture, grow weeds, and require intervention. Covered beds manage themselves. Edible landscaping replacing ornamental planting. The front of the property, the borders, the containers near the entrance, none of it produces anything under conventional design. All of it produces food under a different design philosophy with no additional space required. Herb spirals concentrate multiple microhabitats into a single structure. The top is warm and well-drained for Mediterranean herbs. The base is cool and moisture-retentive for plants that prefer those conditions. A structure smaller than a dining table, producing more variety per square foot than almost anything else I documented. Minimal watering techniques. Deep, infrequent watering trains root systems downward toward permanent moisture rather than shallow, frequent watering, keeping roots at the surface where they dry between sessions. The difference in drought resilience was not marginal. It was decisive. Natural pest management through biodiversity. Predatory insects are moving into gardens that provide habitat. Pest pressure is declining, not because of intervention, but because the garden had created conditions that attracted the things that controlled pests naturally. Greywater reuse. Legal in more jurisdictions than most people realize. Redirecting household water from sinks and showers into outdoor irrigation. The reduction in water use, documented across multiple growing seasons, was substantial. Soil first growing. The inversion of conventional thinking. Conventional growing focuses on feeding the plant. Soil first growing focuses on feeding the soil and allowing the soil to feed the plant. The distinction sounds minor. The results are not. Backyard biodiversity systems. Not gardens optimized for a single outcome, but gardens designed to host multiple species, insects, and soil organisms simultaneously. The more diverse the system, the more stable it became. Stability is what reduces the need for intervention. Crop rotation alternatives. Traditional rotation assumes annual replanting. Perennial systems and polyculture beds create similar benefits without the replanting cycle. Soil pests and diseases fail to establish because the monoculture conditions that favor them never exist. And finally, the food forest model. Not a forest as most people imagine it. A designed planting of trees, shrubs, ground covers, and root crops occupying multiple vertical layers, each supporting the others, producing food across multiple seasons with decreasing inputs over time. Established food forests require minimal intervention after the first 3 years. The ones I documented that were 7 years and older were largely self-managing. 25 ideas, not tips, not trends. Documented, recoverable principles that operate as a unified system. The question that kept returning to me was the same one I could not shake in that first 11-year plot. Why did no one tell me this earlier? Because here is what happens when you begin applying these ideas. The garden resists you at first, not dramatically. Not in ways that are easy to measure. But the expectations you carry, the ones built by 2 years of conventional gardening failure, those expectations are calibrated to a system that demands constant response. When the interventions stop, when you pull back and begin observing rather than controlling, the absence of activity feels like neglect. It does not look like success. Not immediately. The covered soil looks messy. The self-seeding crops look unplanned. The companion planting looks chaotic. And if you are measuring by the standards the conventional system trained you in, you will conclude you are failing again. This is the critical moment. This is where most people return to what they know. I almost did. In the second month of stepping back from intervention, I watched a section of the bed I had left unmanaged begin to fill with low-growing plants I had not placed there. My instinct was to clear them. I documented instead. Within 3 weeks, I identified nitrogen-fixing species, ground cover that was suppressing moisture loss, and one plant that I later confirmed was a natural pest deterrent for the aphid population that had destroyed my lettuce the previous season. The garden had not become chaotic. The garden had begun solving problems I'd been trying to solve with purchased products. That is the evidence that changes your thinking permanently. Not a statistic, not a study. The direct observation that a system, given the conditions to operate, begins to function without you. And once you observe it, the conventional approach stops making sense entirely. The annual replanting cycle, the tilling, the synthetic feeds, the pest sprays, they do not stop being available. They stop being necessary. The shift is not philosophical. It is practical. It is the result of watching a system produce more by requiring less. I need to address what this means for you specifically. Because the reaction I observe most consistently when people encounter these ideas seriously for the first time is not excitement. It is discomfort. The discomfort comes from a specific place. If these ideas are documented, recoverable, and effective, and they are, then the logical conclusion is that the gardening information most people have access to is structured around a different set of priorities than the ones it claims to serve. That is an uncomfortable conclusion. It is also the correct one. Consider what the gardening content industry produces most consistently: seasonal buying guides, annual planting schedules, product reviews, pest treatment recommendations, content that resets each spring, requiring you to return for new information, new recommendations, and new purchases. Content that mirrors the structure of the annual gardening cycle it promotes. Now consider what the 25 ideas in this video produce over time: decreasing inputs, decreasing purchases, decreasing dependency on external information. A system that, after the initial establishment period, largely tells you what it needs through observation rather than through a content calendar. These are not compatible commercial models. One generates recurring engagement. One generates a result that makes further engagement unnecessary. I am not suggesting coordination. I am describing alignment. The content that gets produced and promoted is the content that aligns with the commercial structures supporting its production. Perennial systems, soil first growing, food forests, seed saving, these ideas exist in the documentation. They are not suppressed. They are simply not emphasized in proportion to their effectiveness. And now that you have encountered them in proportion to their effectiveness, something changes in how you read gardening content going forward. You begin to ask different questions. Not what should I buy this season, but what is this system missing that it could provide itself? Not how do I fix this problem, but what condition is allowing this problem to exist? That shift in questioning is more valuable than any individual idea on this list. Because the 25 ideas are not the endpoint. They are the framework that makes the right questions obvious. There is one more thing the record shows. The gardeners who implement these systems consistently report the same unexpected experience at some point between year 2 and year 4. The garden stops needing them in the way they expected. Not entirely. Observation is always required. Adjustment is always required. But the daily intervention, the watering, the feeding, the treating, the replanting, it diminishes to a fraction of what it was. And the space that opens up, the time and energy that was previously consumed by maintaining a system of dependency, creates something that conventional gardening never produced: presence. Actual presence in the garden, not the management of the garden. This is documented differently in different sources. Some describe it as the garden becoming a place rather than a project. Others describe a shift from producer to participant. The language varies. The observation is consistent. And here is the evidence that confirms it is real rather than sentiment. Long-term growers operating perennial and soil, first systems universally report that when they are absent for extended periods, weeks, sometimes months, the system continues. Yields drop in the absence of harvest, which causes some plants to self-seed or go dormant, but the structural integrity of the system holds. A conventional garden left unattended for 2 weeks in midsummer fails. The annual crops exceed harvest, bolt, or succumb to unchecked pest pressure. The soil dries and cracks without its weekly irrigation. The weeds fill the empty spaces that the annual planting never managed to cover. A well-established perennial and polyculture system left for the same period adapts. It does not thrive in the human sense, but it does not collapse. That distinction, the difference between a system that fails without you and a system that continues without you, is the clearest measure of whether the garden has been built correctly. And it is the clearest measure of how far modern gardening has moved from the systems that made it durable. I returned to that 11-year plot 18 months after my first visit. The gardener had been ill. She had not maintained the space in nearly 4 months. I expected deterioration. I expected the evidence that absence reveals the overgrowth, the collapse, the signs of a system that had lost its manager. What I found was different. The garden had reorganized. Plants that had been in one configuration during my first visit had shifted. Some had spread, some had retreated, some had disappeared and been replaced by volunteers from previous seasons. The overall structure had changed, but it was not deteriorating. It was adjusting. I documented what was producing. Perennial vegetables continue their cycles. Fruit-bearing shrubs at the canopy edge are still yielding. Ground-level herbs are spreading into paths that would have required weekly maintenance in a conventional setup. The garden had not missed her, not in the way a conventional garden misses its gardener. And when she came back, reduced energy, moving more slowly, limited to brief visits, she did not rebuild from zero. She returned to a system that had held her place. She adjusted what was adjustable. She observed what was self-managing, and she harvested what continued to produce. And resilience is not visible in photographs of peak season. It is visible in the fourth consecutive drought year, when the conventional plots around it failed and hers continued. It is visible in the month of absence, when nothing was maintained, and yet the structure held. It is visible in the season she returned at reduced capacity and found the system had not abandoned the work she had done. These are the outcomes that do not generate content. They do not produce the visual drama of a perfect harvest photograph. They do not require you to return to a channel each spring for updated guidance, but they are the outcomes that matter. The ones the documentation consistently shows and the popular conversation consistently overlooks. Here is what the record ultimately shows. The 25 ideas in this video were not invented recently. They were not developed by content creators or discovered by gardening influencers. They are documented principles, some of them over a century old, that have been practiced continuously by growers who never abandoned them and are now being rediscovered by growers who were failed by what replaced them. The failure was systematic. It was built into the design of the information most people received. Annual cycles, input dependency, seasonal purchasing, content that resets, a loop that generates engagement and revenue by ensuring that the gardener never fully arrives at the outcome that would make further guidance unnecessary. These 25 ideas break that loop, not because they are radical, because they are functional. They are built on the observable reality of how plants, soil, and ecosystems behave when allowed to operate without constant disruption. That reality was documented. It was practiced. And it was quietly moved out of the mainstream conversation because the mainstream conversation had other priorities. You are watching this video because something in the conventional approach was not working. That instinct was correct. The approach was not designed to work indefinitely. It was designed to keep you returning. These ideas are designed differently. They are designed to reach a point where the garden carries more of the work than you do, where the system retains what it builds across seasons, across years, across decades, where the outcome is not a perfect season, but a durable one. You will not see results from all 25 ideas simultaneously. The system builds, it requires the first season to observe, the second to adjust, and the third to begin seeing the stability that makes the whole framework legible. But here is what the documented evidence consistently shows about what happens on the other side of that establishment period. Growers who reach it do not return to conventional methods, not because they are philosophically committed to an alternative, but the results make the comparison impossible to argue. The garden that runs itself, the soil that improves without external inputs, the system that holds when you cannot be there. That is not a gardening trend. That is what gardening was before it was redesigned into something you had to keep buying. The documentation was always there. The evidence never disappeared. The only thing that changed was what you were told to look at. And now that you are looking at something different, the only question worth asking is this. What are you going to build that will still be producing long after the season that started is gone? The soil does not forget what you give it, and neither does the system you are about to design.